Well, welcome to Richie's Roost on a beautiful, sunshiny afternoon. We needed it after that rain. We're delighted that this weather's turned off dry for a few days at least. I'll tell you something before we get started. There is a blog that I read daily called Day Late History by, it's written by um, a retired Navy officer named Dick McCrillis. Happens to know my son. He was a pilot, Navy pilot, and he writes this blog about what happened yesterday in history. Very very informative, and I use it a lot. And I'm going to use some of the stuff today that I saw yesterday. I want to talk about three subjects today. One is hyperbole that we tend to use today. The second is a touching on freedom of speech. And the third, I don't know exactly how to categorize that except just for revulsion, but we'll get into it and let you determine that. Well, in the first, which addresses the hyperbole, there was a man named Arthur Travers, they called him Bomber Harris, who was an air marshal and the commander-in-chief of the Royal Air Force Bomber Command during World War II. Arthur Travers Harris, called him Bomber. He was at the business end of executing the concept of massive area bombing of German cities with such success as the firestorm in Hamburg. Hamburg, they called it. Look, he had a hate for the Nazis, there's no question about it, because Britain had just been pummeled for years and years. London was in ruins almost. So he was in charge of bombing all these German cities. And he had many pithy quotes, but his probably best remembered for his February 1945, now this is right at the end of the war, expostulation, is that the good word, expostulation? He said, I do not personally regard the whole of the remaining cities of Germany as worth the bones of one British grenadier. I don't believe that. I don't believe a rational human being really means that, but he said it. Just like today we say things like that we don't believe. And that gets us in trouble. And we back off in our corners and we make statements like that do nothing more than just add to the firestorm. So I need to watch myself. I don't know, you might not ever use something like that, but a lot of times I might tend to exaggerate and say that he's the worst one I ever saw. Well, maybe. Hyperbole. Don't do it anymore. I'm going to try not to do it anymore. Okay. Freedom of speech. Excuse me. Freedom of speech. In 1919, there was a guy named Eugene V. Debs, D-E-B-S, ran for president 5 times. Now, he was sent to prison in 1919 under the sedition provision of the Espionage Act of 1917. He was a fiery Union man and a leader of the Socialist Party USA. He earned the undying enmity of President Roosevelt Wilson for his continuing series of speeches against the U.S., our participation in World War I, and in particular against the draft. Now, he in a 1918 anti-draft speech was the last straw. He was arrested and charged with 10 counts of sedition, and he called no defense witness, at his trial, but he spoke in his own behalf in a 2-hour statement that was called by a quote journalist, question mark journalist, use the term loosely, named Haywood Brown, Broun. Brown said that the speech was one of the most beautiful and moving passages in the English language. He was, for that one afternoon, touched in the English language. He was touched with inspiration. If anyone told me that tongues of fire danced upon his shoulders as he spoke, I would believe it. Yeah, tongues of fire. He made a whole lot of folks mad, including Woodrow Wilson. And during subsequent clemency proceedings, they asked for clemency. President Wilson wrote, while the flower of American youth was pouring out its blood to vindicate the cause of civilization, this man, Debs, stood behind the lines, sniping, attacking, and denouncing them. This man was a traitor to his country, and he'll never be pardoned during my administration. And he wasn't. But Debs' 10-year sentence was eventually commuted by President Harding correctly. Nobody hardly agreed with what the guy was saying, preaching. But he went to prison speaking his mind, and that was wrong. And he was eventually commuted by President Harding, and he died in 1926. So that's my message there. We're not going through things today that haven't happened before. Chastised for freedom of speech. We've got it. We need to use it. Regardless of what folks think sometimes, under the Constitution, we have that right. Now, this last thing I'm going to talk about is terrible. There was a place called Katyn Forest in Poland. And in 1943, in that forest, during their drive across Poland, the German army discovered in that forest a series of mass graves containing the bodies of over 20,000 Polish prisoners captured by the Soviets during the 1939 partition of that country. The Germans discovered that mass grave when they went across Poland in 1943. This is at the height of World War II. Well, in a rare display of honest revulsion, the Germans were absolutely just revulsed. The Nazis announced the findings to the world, convening an international panel of forensic experts and neutral journalists to document the breadth and scope of the massacre. Now, Joseph Goebbels, you'll remember he was the propaganda chief of the Nazi Party. He was frank about using the findings for anti-Soviet propaganda purposes, recognizing that if they didn't get the story out first, these are the Germans, if they didn't get the story out first, the Soviets would certainly turn it around on the Germans in the event of the Russian reoccupation of the site. They knew that if the Russians reoccupied it and found those mass graves, they'd turn it around and blame the Nazis for it. Now, the Soviets steadfastly denied their culpability until 1990, when the release of archival documents vividly showed how the Beria Khrushchev and Stalin himself recognized significant post-war opportunities for the communist movement if they could decapitate the leadership of Poland during the cover of war. You see what they did? They decapitated the leadership of Poland just in case during the war they were to get Poland back, which they did. And one aside in here, one quote from, if I can remember it, Stalin, the animal Stalin. He said that one death is terrible. He didn't say terrible, he said something like a dismay or something. One death is terrible. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. One death is terrible. 1,000,000 deaths is a statistic. Nice guy. Well, but the final tally of the murdered victims of this massacre included over half of the Polish officer corps at the time, including 14 generals, an admiral, and appropriately higher numbers of colonels and below, including as well doctors, police leadership, university professors, and members of the technical elite. And one of the more tawdry pieces of the Katyn puzzle is the reaction of the Western Allies on hearing the news of the massacre. The Allies became aware of the German discoveries because of radio intercepts that were reported back to Berlin by the Germans. And as the story played out, the Polish government in exile in London demanded an investigation by the International Committee of the Red Cross with a specific intent of holding the Soviet Union accountable for its actions. The Poles knew what happened, and they were trying to get this set up so that the intent was placed where it was proven to be done by the Soviets. But the Russians, in true Soviet fashion, turned the Polish argument on its head, accusing the Poles themselves of collaborating with the Nazis, and then followed up by severing diplomatic relations with the Polish government. Typical Russian expletive deleted. At this point, the now increasingly hostile Polish/Soviet crisis, here's a sticky problem. They threatened to shatter the absolutely vital alliance between the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, basically the United States, England, and France. Now remember, this is right at the height of World War II, and nobody really knew what the outcome was going to be. It was still pretty up in the air, 1943. But, unfortunately, even with their certain knowledge of the truth, both Roosevelt and Churchill, heroes to both nations, found themselves increasingly torn between their moral and political support for the Poles and their practical need not to lose their eastern ally, the Soviet Union. Both the Britons and the United States then took pains to intentionally shift public blame to the Nazis, which led to further compromise of what had once been core moral principles. Both of them knew the truth. Both of them turned it around. Now, before you get to be too hard on them, you got to remember they weren't sure they could win the war without the Soviets, and we were fighting the Nazis. So they had a choice between the moral and the practical. What would you have done before you judge them too harshly? So there we are. We've got similar situations today. Should we be over in Ukraine? Should we continue to pour money there? Should we do a lot of other things like that? What's the moral, the practical solutions? It ain't easy sometimes. So you think about it, and I'd really like to know what your solution would have been. Not easy. Okay, that's enough for today. Pretty heavy stuff. I guess I sort of apologize for bringing something like that up on such a beautiful, sunshiny day, but, well, we'll try to do better next time. I'm Jim Ritchie, and I'll see you again next time.